Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Professor Tamara Ownsworth, the Research Director at the Hopkins Centre, and it's my pleasure to present this month's Hopkins Centre information session that's designed for supporting clinicians to engage in research. Today we're focusing on the upcoming seed grant round. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. So I'm at the Nathan campus, which is the Yuggera and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So today we're talking about the Hopkins Seed Grant round 8, actually, which officially opens next week. But we wanted to hold an early session to really support clinicians to start thinking about ideas so that they're ready for the expression of interest round, which will open in the middle of February, or EOIs are due in the middle of February. So to that end, we're providing some advice and tips today on how you can plan your seed grant projects and be really ready to submit that EOI mid-February. So an important part of the development of a seed grant process is to speak with the program leader from the Hopkins Centre. So we'll talk about the programs of research that the seed grant needs to align with, but just to make sure everyone is aware that the program leaders are Professor Tim Geraghty and myself for program 1 and Professor Louise Gustafsson for program 2. So we are the best people to contact to discuss your ideas and the concepts for the grant and alignment with the Hopkins research. So we have our emails actually provided later in today's talk, but also they'll be available in the guidelines that are emailed next week. If your application relates to more of a technical issue to do with the seed grant, such as eligibility, all the rules associated with the grants, then Associate Professor David Trembath is the best person to contact because he will actually be the chair of the panel, supported by Elizabeth Kendall. And because we're coming up to the Christmas period, there's obviously going to be periods of leave. So please do get in contact with us and we'll respond when we're able to. So thank you for that. Okay, so the seed grants is one of a number of initiatives that we have here at the Hopkins Centre that supports clinician engagement in research. And you would be aware that our focus in the Hopkins Centre is on promoting interdisciplinary, priority-driven and collaborative research. So the seed grants are one mechanism through which we aim to bring different people together, so people with disabilities and their families, clinicians, policymakers and researchers, to identify some of the challenges that people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives after a neurological injury and to identify shared ideas for some of the solutions that could address these issues or challenges and result in measurable improvements in quality of life. So through this collaboration, we're aiming to build both clinical and research capacity and engage particularly early career researchers, clinical researchers and citizen researchers. And the seed grant scheme in particular is interested in research that's close to practice, that has that strong translational focus, that's informed by end users and embedded in practice. So the 8th round, the 2024 scheme, so we've been running this now for 8 rounds, so it's quite an established scheme. As I mentioned, aiming to support new interdisciplinary research projects in the disability and rehabilitation area. We're particularly keen to support early career researchers to lead and establish programs of research. So because these projects go for 1 year only, so they're 12 months, the scope is really important to consider. So a lot of the successful grants that we have funded previously tend to be more startup research or pilot work, where researchers are looking at the feasibility or an acceptability of a new clinical process, assessment, intervention and so forth. But there still needs to be a translational focus on the research. And it could also be a progression of an existing research project and or upscaling of research that clinicians are already engaged in. So the team is very important to consider for the seed grant. So it's important that there is at least one team member from the Department of Rehabilitation, Metro South Health, and one from Griffith University, so an academic that's in the Hopkins Centre, and I'll come back to that point. So we're very keen that the SEED grant supports the development of early career clinician researchers and also engages people with lived experience. But really, these SEED grants involve a collaboration amongst the best team that's required to carry out the grant successfully. So this tends to be a mix of clinical research and industry partners that are essential to the conduct of the research, but also the practical implementation of the grant. So one of the eligibility criteria for the SEED grant is that projects are aligned with the Hopkins Program 1 or 2, and rather than kind of duplicating the research that we're already doing in those programs, we look to complement or extend or value add to these research programs. So I'm going to touch briefly on each program just so people are aware of the nature of the research that is being conducted. But this is why it's such an important requirement that people reach out to a program leader and share their ideas and get some feedback on the alignment with our programs. So we are looking for projects that will substantively build on research previously funded by SEED grants and clinical fellowships, so not duplicating or repeating that research but building upon it. And we are looking for innovation, so research that does, break some new ground from a clinical point of view or a research point of view that's relevant to rehabilitation and disability. And then obviously projects are judged based on their merit as well as their alignment. So program 1, which is led by myself and Tim, is evidence-based practice and community interventions, or sometimes we say community supports. And so this has a number of project themes. So the first one is focusing on mapping people's care pathways and trajectories and identifying unmet needs and issues with service access, with the overarching aim of improving rehabilitation systems, improving the care transitions across the care continuum, and supporting people's outcomes, particularly as they transition from the hospital to the community, and focusing on equitable access to services and support. The second program has more of a focus on self-advocacy.
That meeting, and that will be sent.
And so the self-advocacy project is looking at supporting people's expression of choice and preference and engagement in decisions about their rehabilitation across the care continuum. The third one is focused on psychological well-being, so either identifying issues that increase the risk of psychological distress or focusing on the management and promotion of psychosocial well-being. And the fourth is focused on sustainable employment and inclusive workplaces. Program 2, Enabling Technologies and Environments. This is led by Louise Gustafsson and Elizabeth Kendall. So this program of research is focusing on supporting the uptake of safe and effective technology in rehabilitation, particularly relating to the co-design of bespoke technology solutions. So engaging with all the different end users and contributors to technology development and implementation with a focus on personalisation and inclusive technology. Then the broader environmental focus is on design and modification of public spaces, neighbourhoods, homes, workplaces to enhance quality of life and independence. And then on a more broader scale, looking at the infrastructure out in the community, such as national parks, public transport, urban design, and so forth. So yeah, micro level technology through to larger spaces and places where people are at their best. So if you have any ideas or interests clinically relating to Program 1 or Program 2, please do reach out and get in touch. There's nothing we enjoy talking more about than the research that we're conducting. So to give you a bit of an idea of the types of projects that have been really well received, this is the list of of successful seed grants from round 7. So these expressions of interest went in February this year, and then the outcomes of the full application were announced at the end of June. And then our researchers have hit the ground running in July with ethics and governance applications. So if you just look over the nature of the projects, you'll see how these do align quite nicely with Program 1 or Program 2. So the first one is actually led by Delina Amsters, and we'll hear from Delina a bit later today more about this project. So her focus is on change champions with a view to implementing health literacy tools in rehabilitation. So this aligns really nicely with the self-advocacy project, which is aiming to increase people's participation in decisions about their care. The second one, Supporting Friendships and Social Connection, is led by Melissa Kendall, and this one fits really nicely with the psychological intervention project with a focus on psychosocial wellbeing. The third one, Sustained Employment, and looking at case studies from 3 different perspectives. This one is led by Jessie Mitchell and aligns very nicely with the Sustainable Employment and Inclusive Workplaces program. The next one is focused on virtual reality-based nature exposure. So the role of technology really in enhancing individuals' environment or enriching environments whilst people are still in hospital. Also supporting mental health, so it kind of spans both programs nicely. And that is led by Mike Norwood. And then the 5th one focuses on home modification process and outcomes, and that's led by Coral Gillett. And the final one, Implementing Technology-Aided Physiotherapy, that's part of Habitech, so focusing very much on personalisation and utility of rehabilitation in practice. So the timeline for round 8, so we're having a bit of an early information session today that we're designed really around clinicians' interests and encouraging that early planning and positioning yourself well for the timeline next year. We're holding a broader information session and Q&A at the very end of January. That's only 2 weeks before the EOI though, so I felt that it would be important to hold one now. Also bearing in mind that I know that a lot of clinicians take leave in December and January, very well deserved leave. So I thought the earlier that we encourage people to start thinking about round 8, the better position they'll be in at the end of January. So the expression of interest is due February 16th. And then full application, so the EOIs are reviewed by a panel, and we then provide feedback to all the applicants regardless of whether they proceed to a full application. So these will be invited early March and then due towards the end of April. And then we aim to announce the outcomes early June with projects commencing and funding in place by July. So it's a bit of a tight time frame for a seed grant that is only for 12 months. So as I mentioned before, very important to consult or get in contact with program leaders quite early on in the piece. In a moment, I'll talk through the phases of developing an idea for research through to EOI, and I've got a bit of a recommendation as to when it would be a good time to reach out to us, but really we're keen to hear from you at any point in time. And the email addresses that I mentioned before are displayed on this page. Now, I've mentioned before that it is important that seed grants do align with either program. If you do have an idea that you're not sure if it does fit into the program and you'd like to discuss it, please get in touch, because sometimes it actually does align, but you're maybe not aware of exactly how or where. So yeah, don't be put off by the specific nature of the projects that I mentioned and think that your idea isn't necessarily going to value add. If in doubt, definitely get in touch with us. So the seed grant scheme, the value of individual grants range from 20 to 40,000, and usually the budgets relate to direct research costs. So research assistance is a big one, clinical buyout for research, consumables relevant to the project, and other justified fieldwork costs. And we also allow some knowledge translation costs, such as conference presentations, for example, supporting you to attend conferences and present. Importantly, the application you put forward must not have current funding or been previously funded by another source. That doesn't mean that it can't relate to an existing project, but you need to show how it is distinctive and that the outcomes will be very much kind of unique and supported by the seed grant as opposed to another grant that you may have in place. There is only a 12 months duration, so the scope of the grant is really important to think about. And CIAs may seek approval to vary the time frame, but the funds still need to be expended within 12 months. So that's a very important consideration because of our own funding structure here at the Hopkins Centre. So the CIA must be a member of the Hopkins Centre with a substantive position with the, Department of Rehabilitation, PA or other Metro South Clinical Rehabilitation Services affiliated with Hopkins Centre, or Griffith University. So it's either or here. So either the Division of Rehabilitation or Griffith University at a FTE of 0.5 or higher. And all CIs listed on the application must be Hopkins members. So if they're part of another university, for example, or another service that's not directly affiliated, they can be listed as an associate investigator, but not a CI. Okay, so here are what I've conceptualised as the steps of research, and then thought about where the EOI would fit in here. So all phases of research, I go through this all the time in terms of conceptualising a problem or a question that I would like to answer. I then look to see whether somebody else has answered it for me. So conducting a literature review, also talking to colleagues. So just because I haven't come across research that answers this question, I talk to colleagues who are also in the field to ask if they're aware of relevant research they can direct me towards. So that kind of exploring phase of seeing whether an idea that I have is novel or whether it's actually been addressed already. Then forming a clear and testable question. So this has to really clearly operationalise what you want to look at. So, for example, you can't be vague and say, is counselling helpful or beneficial for people? You need to be very specific about the population of people you're focusing on, what kind of intervention is of interest, and are you comparing that to like an alternative intervention? So you have to really form the question clearly, and I'll give you an example in a moment. So at this point, I'd like to just recommend some resources that we've developed through the Hopkins Centre, led by Letitia Burridge. So we have some resources that actually support clinicians to identify testable questions, and these are the self-directed learning modules, which are available on the intranet Metro South Health. If you're not sure how to find these resources, please do get in touch with Letitia Burridge or the Hopkins Centre, and we can direct you to the link for those. They're kind of self-paced online modules. So once you've come up with your clear and testable question, that's when you're wanting to identify the best research design or method for investigating or answering that question. You also want to develop the team around you that's going to support you. And I should say that these steps aren't always in this order. Sometimes the team is there from the outset and it's a bit of an iterative process. So it's around this time, though, that we would recommend that you reach out to a program leader at Hopkins for the seed grant. So when you've got your problem or question in mind, you've reviewed the literature, you've started to think about the methods and the design that you might employ, and also who needs to be involved to support this research idea into practice. And then really the final step before preparing your EOI is to really scope the feasibility and logistics of the project that you've identified and get some feedback from end users, so people for whom the research is developed to benefit. So that could be some other clinicians, it could be some of the clients or the end users of your service, and industry partners as well. Ask them whether they think that this is, a project that's going to result in meaningful outcomes. I think that's a very important process. You can also do that from the very outset when you're conceptualising your problem. So it's at this point that you'd be preparing your EOI for our scheme. And then obviously if you're successful with your application, you then go on to prepare your ethics protocol and apply for ethics and governance, conduct the research, disseminate knowledge and promote uptake. So it is quite a multifaceted process, but there is a lot of support along the way. So in terms of planning a seed grant, very important that the concept of the grant is well thought through from a clinical perspective, that it's a problem or issue that you've identified that is having an impact on service delivery and client outcomes, so that there is a very clear rationale for why you've chosen this particular clinical problem, at what point you are in the care continuum, and that you have conducted a literature review to see whether the answers actually are already in the literature and may be applicable to your setting. Sometimes there is a fair amount of literature that is helpful, but it's not relevant to your setting. So you just need to be very clear on why this research needs to be conducted at this point in time. And it may be that you've done your own background research through your service. So you might have done some kind of quality assurance type activity or an audit that's providing that local context for the research. Or it may be the next logical step in an ongoing program of research that you have been part of with colleagues. As I mentioned, that clear and testable question or hypothesis is really important to guide a seed grant. And we are looking for novelty. So we're looking for new ideas and value add where you would be addressing a knowledge gap or some important practice, area of practice advance. So your project should have rigorous science and methodology based on an established framework. So if you're wanting to do qualitative interviews with people, you should very much be guided by the standards of qualitative research and be connected to the literature on those frameworks. So I cannot say it again too many times. Apologies for the repetition, but the alignment with our programs and speaking to a program leader well before the expression of interest is due. And that is because we are here to provide guidance and advice and to connect you sometimes to the literature if it's our area of research, but also to team members that might be a real asset for the project. So there's all sorts of tips and ideas that we can offer if it's early enough and not, for example, the day before or on the day that the EOIs are due. So I just want to give you an example. I've mentioned many times clear and testable questions. So I just wanted to share with you a pitch that I wrote some time ago that also serves as a research lay summary. So here the aim is to convey what the research is about, why it's important, how you'll tackle the question, who will benefit and how. So a number of years ago, I conducted this study. So my lay rationale: people with severe brain injury can find it difficult to learn new tasks due to memory and executive function problems. This affects their progress in rehabilitation and increases dependence on family support. So that's the problem and the rationale for research. Our research aims to compare two different approaches to teaching people new skills in therapy. One approach involves allowing people to make errors and providing feedback on those errors. That's error-based learning. The other involves preventing errors from happening to ensure only correct performance, and that's errorless learning. So that comparison of these two approaches will provide new evidence that can guide the approaches used by therapists in brain injury rehabilitation. This may in turn improve people's independence and psychological well-being. So that's the who will benefit and how. So being able to write this, sometimes it's called an elevator pitch. So it's 100 to 150 words, and just being able to express this clearly and concisely is quite a skill, but it's often the initial step of conceptualising your research that then comes through in the EOI that you submit. So because we're only looking at 12 months for the entire timeline, there's a lot of focus on the feasibility of the seed grant. And we've learned quite recently that ethics and governance, can take longer than previously or expected. So we recommend that you factor in at least 3 months. And by that, we mean if you were starting that process within the month of receiving the grant, expect that would take at least 3 months. So really trying to avoid projects that have multiple phases where you need multiple rounds of ethical clearance, because with the 12-month time frame, that's not going to be feasible. So at least 3 months should be clear in your timeline that you're putting forward. So if your project is part of a larger planned project and you're wanting to conduct a phase as a C grant, just to ensure that it's scaled appropriately in terms of the time frame, but also that there will be outcomes rather than requiring more funding for the study continue to achieve those outcomes. So it should be a contained study that has outcomes in its own right, rather than depending on further funding for it to be completed. So that's just something very careful to plan. If it's pilot research, which it often is, we still expect quite robust methodology. So a number of studies are looking at, for example, feasibility and acceptability, and there are good frameworks around research on feasibility and acceptability that we would expect researchers to refer to and be guided by. And obviously, if you're not sure about that, that's where we're here to offer some advice. So I've done quite a lot of pilot research where we've followed this framework for assessing feasibility and acceptability. The other thing that we really look for these grants is a clear and specific plan for knowledge dissemination and translation. So we refer to this sometimes as the pathway to impact. So a C grant usually has multiple impacts in terms of the close to practice focus resulting in a change in service delivery or clinical practice, but we're also looking at how we disseminate that. So whether that is through publication, conference presentation, or forums and in-services. So there are multiple ways that you can demonstrate your pathway to impact. Okay, the team is a very important element of the C grant, at the very least for moral support, but also for a lot of practical assistance as well. So with the team, we look very much at the collective strengths of the team, but also what role each individual team member will play. So across your projects, there's likely to be both clinical expertise, sometimes lived experience expertise, and also methodology expertise. So if you're putting forward that you're going to do a pilot clinical trial and no one on your team has expertise in clinical trials, that could be a disadvantage. So you don't want just a really large number of team members who aren't actually actively contributing their knowledge and expertise. They should be very much logical to the project. And we're also looking for teams that provide capacity building to at least one team member, but ideally multiple team members who perhaps are early career researchers or novice researchers or a citizen researcher. But the eligibility requires at least one member from the Department of Rehabilitation Metro South and at least one Griffith academic in Hopkins. And sometimes clinicians approach us and say, I don't know anyone at Griffith University or Hopkins that could be involved. So that's why we're here. We have a wonderful team of research fellows that are employed across both Program 1 and Program 2, and we're also affiliated with a lot of academics in the broader university in psychology, allied health, engineering. So yeah, we kind of know who to link people with. So consumer engagement is highly valued for the C grants. That doesn't mean that every grant must have a citizen researcher, although you will find in the most recent round that most did. But consumer engagement can come in a number of different ways. So it can involve like a formal phase of co-design, a consumer advisory panel. So maybe they're not, consumers aren't investigators, but you actually have a panel that offers you advice from the inception through to the end of the project. That's increasingly becoming expected in a lot of grant schemes actually, and I noticed in the Metro South Health awards ceremony the other night that there was a consumer representative on a lot of projects. So consumer informed and consumer led research is something we really value and promote at the Hopkins Centre. So strongly advise that you consider that aspect of your project. We also welcome, but certainly don't require, partnerships within and outside of Metro South Health. My only, I guess, little caveat there is to be aware that if you list people as AIs, because they can't be CIs if they're outside of Griffith or Metro South, that the ethical clearance and governance process is a little bit more complicated because everyone listed as an investigator, associate or otherwise, has to go through ethical clearance at their own institution, or they have to approve the contract for IP. So there's been some changes in that recently, that there is increased requirement that people listed on a research grant, that their own institution has provided ethics approval for the project, and it tends to get sent to their legal office for the contractual requirements as well. So just be aware of those partnerships outside of Griffith and Metro South, that it can take a little bit longer with the ethics and governance, and just to factor that into your timescale. Okay, so my final kind of area of advice relates to the budget and resources. So we do look at the budget carefully, and it's part of the selection criteria. So all items need to be reasonable and justified as part of your explanation for requesting those funds. And final, but definitely not a small issue, very early on in your planning, it's really important that you talk to your department or service manager about staff roles and time commitments, not only your own if you're CIA, but of the team members who are part of your service. So research can be very difficult to juggle alongside clinical practice, and if it's involving multiple team members, that can be excellent for capacity building, but it also is placing some demands on the service. So having your manager support that, and we actually ask that you indicate in the EOI that you have discussed and had approval to proceed with the EOI. So here are the sections of the EOI. We have designed this carefully with the aim of reducing how onerous the process is, but also allowing enough detail that we can assess the merit of an application and provide meaningful feedback to proceed to the next full application phase. So CIAs, the person leading the grant, needs to attach a 2-page CV that particularly outlines their research experience as well as their clinical expertise. You need to indicate that you have consulted with a program leader, and that doesn't mean just letting a program leader know that you are submitting the application, but actually asking for time to meet with the program leader, which can happen in person or through Teams, and seeking feedback on the draft of the EOI or your project pitch. We ask you to put the title, a lay summary, 1-page project proposal, that would really be looking at the background and rationale, the aims or hypotheses, the methods and procedures, the timeline, and also the expected outcomes. So then there's a small section on significance, impact and benefits, which might actually overlap with expected outcomes actually. You're then asked to list your research team. Now the team members listed at the EOI, these can change, so don't feel that if you're putting someone's name down or you haven't put everyone's name down at the EOI, you can build on that for the full application. We do ask that you tell us a bit about involvement of service users or consumers, so your consumer engagement plan, and then the project budget, and then just indicating whether you have existing ethical clearance or whether you will need to apply for that. And so you submit the EOI, so this is due February 16th, to the Hopkins Centre email. So we have a panel who will provide a review of each application. So panel members will review each application, and then they'll provide comments and scoring that will allow us to gauge the merit of each application, and also the strengths and the weaknesses of the application, that we can then provide feedback to people to strengthen their application if they're invited to proceed to the full round. And if they're not, it's still very helpful to have that in feedback, that feedback that would allow you to consider that for future rounds of the Sea Grant project or other grant opportunities. Okay, so I'd now like to give you the opportunity to hear from someone who has been a direct recipient recently